Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Duke, and thank you again for joining us for yet another lecture series, this time a very fascinating and relevant topic, the history of human dissection in Western culture. Now, I understand that for a lot of people there may be some trepidation about tackling a subject like this. When we think of the human dissection, it can be a very unsettling thing. We think about bodies being stripped bare in the pursuit of science or for the purpose of autopsy, trying to discover why somebody died. And we can get a little queasy about that, especially when we think of our own personhood and mortality. But there are so many aspects to the history of human dissection for thousands of years in world culture, really. The study of medicine, the practice of healing, was based on a complete lack of understanding about the anatomical makeup of the human form. In order for us to have anything like modern medicine, we needed a vigorous protocol of dissection, which developed really quite late in the world, and primarily in the Western world, where Western culture became the first culture to really methodically dissect bodies. But along with issues of medicine and science, the whole question of human dissection is bound up with all sorts of moral, ethical, religious, spiritual implications. The construction of knowledge itself. So in studying this issue for the next 4 lectures, I think we're going to get a lot more than just what took place in these dissection theaters. We're going to get a huge understanding of a major cultural impetus in terms of how we approach knowledge, how we gather knowledge. When did it dawn on us as a species? When did it dawn on human beings? The seemingly illogical prospect that in order to know how something works, you have to pull it apart. In order to understand how something functions, you have to effectively disaggregate it, pull it to pieces. You could imagine, when you look at it that way, you can imagine why it took a long time for people in the world to come to the conclusion that by taking human bodies apart, we might actually be able to figure out how living bodies better function. And so if we think about it that way, this makes a lot more sense. And if we start today, the first lecture deals with dissection in the ancient world. So I said before, no culture anywhere in the world, none, zero zip, dissected bodies. Up until relatively recently, there's one exception to that, which we'll get to momentarily, and that was a brief period in the ancient Greek world. But prior to that, you did have, despite the fact that you had no methodical scientific dissection of human bodies, you had ancient cultures going all the way back to 3,500 BC with the Egyptians, and we all know about Egyptian mummification. Now, one of the things that's really remarkable is well before you had scientific culture and scientific dissection, you had religious cultures. And it is interesting that you think about the evolution of human development. We didn't evolve, we didn't evolve as a species that was scientific first. We were philosophical and we were spiritual first as a culture. So going back to our picture of the Egyptians here, all early cultures came to their medical knowledge through religion. And here we have the image of the jackal-headed god Anubis. He was the god of the Egyptians of the underworld. And it's interesting. For hundreds of years now, we assume that this god had the head of a jackal, when modern DNA analysis on certain mummified canids suggests that it really wasn't a jackal, it was a African golden wolf. Nonetheless, the god of the underworld for the Egyptians was this jackal-headed, this wolf-headed creature, who also was the god of mummification. We know that the Egyptians mummified the bodies of their dead so that they would enhance their afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the spirit, the ka, of the individual would return to its body and its earthly possessions at various points during the day and the evening, and that the path to immortality, meeting up with the god Osiris in the other world, required that you had these accommodations made for bodies. So Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification in the underworld, Osiris, this is the primordial myth. Osiris and his wife Isis were 2 of the most powerful gods. And Osiris at one point was attacked and chopped in pieces by Set, his vicious brother. And then the pieces of the god Osiris were tossed into the Nile River. Isis, the wife of Osiris, retrieved those disaggregated, torn in pieces body parts and put them all together like a jigsaw puzzle. She brought back to life her husband Osiris. And out of this myth came this myth of resurrection, this myth of mummification, how mummification putting back together, holding a body in place, not letting it deconstruct, not letting it rot, would be a major boon to the spirit in the other world. And so in ancient Greek culture, ancient Egyptian culture, you had the role of the chief embalmer. And again, this is a religious festival. The chief embalmer also wore a jackal mask. He was the Harisheshta in Egyptian. And he, in order to mimic the god Anubis, would wear the jackal-headed mask. It took about 70 days to embalm and mummify a body. And what the Egyptians did is they would open the body in a variety of ways, and they would remove the organs. Now, again, you have to have a pretty sophisticated knowledge to be able to make an incision on the left side of the abdomen, to be able to go in and take out the major organs, or to get the brain to come out, the way that they dealt with that. Because they were going to use these organs as a way of, also had to be preserved and mummified along with the body, because they would be required later as well. And so it took from beginning to end about 70 days to embalm a body. To give you one example of what we're dealing with here in terms of mummification, if you look at our second picture, we saw the god Anubis attending to mummification. And what the chief embalmer did is he would slip a hook inside the brain via the nostrils. So when we say dissection, we're being kind of obviously vague here. The Egyptians didn't dissect bodies, and they certainly didn't do it for medical knowledge, but they had to open bodies, and they had to remove things, and they had to have a fairly sophisticated understanding of how to get at them. In this case, the ancient Egyptians actually believed that the brain was relatively worthless. They believed, the Egyptians, that the heart was the center of the existence. It was the first thing to live. It was the last thing to die, to stop beating. And so for the Egyptians, the heart was the center of everything. And that's why Egyptian embalmers almost always left the heart of the mummy in place. All the other major organs were removed, but the heart, which was the beginning and the end, it was left. And so in this particular procedure, they didn't really get the brain out. What they did is they would insert a hook into the sinus cavities, and they would stir up the relatively watery soft tissue of the brain until it liquefied, and then it would drain out. This is how they cleaned out the skull case. And then they emptied out the organs. We mentioned the incision on the left side of the body. After the body was completely washed and shaved, they'd make an incision, they'd pull out the lungs, the intestine, they would pull the intestines, the liver, they would pull out the remaining major organs, and they would dry the organs with a very moisture-absorbing drying salt called natron, N-A-T-R-O-N, and they would preserve the organs as well as the interior of the body cavity. These are canopic jars, right? Canopic jars. These are the 4 jars named after 4 different gods, sons of the god of the Egyptian kings. All the kings of Egypt worship the god Horus. He was the god of kings. And the 4 children, the 4 sons of Horus, each had a different shape. You see the jackal again, you see the falcon, you see the baboon, and you see the human shape. These jars, and you can see how the tops pop off, these jars would receive the mummified remains of different organs. So, for instance, the jackal-faced canopic jar would hold the stomach, the falcon-shaped one would hold the intestines, the baboon one would hold the lungs, and the human canopic jar would hold the liver. And all of this, of course, is for ritualistic theological purposes. By preserving these organs with the natron, by mummifying and drying them out so that they would endure, putting them in the jars themselves would be placed in the sarcophagus with the mummy as well. And so the entire body, to some degree, would be preserved with the bandaging. That was only the last part that we see. The inside of the body had to be treated first. We have this idea here that Anubis, this next picture, Anubis, besides being an embalming god, a god of preparing bodies to be mummified, he was also very much a god who weighed the heart. We mentioned that the heart remained inside the cadaver, the corpse, because it was the first thing to live, the last to die. That was where the seat of consciousness was. We're so used to, as modern people, with our modern understanding of science, we're so used to thinking that when we think through our brains. So for us, we center thinking naturally in the head. But imagine if your whole orientation was different anatomically, and that your culture believed that it was the heart that it was the source and origin of all thought. Here you have in the afterlife, not only did Anubis become the god of mummification, but he weighed. At the top picture, you can see him weighing with his right hand there. He's weighing a human heart, and in the left hand, you can see the scales on either side there. The heart's on one side, the left side, and there's an ostrich feather on the right side. Anubis would weigh the human heart of the individual who died alongside an ostrich feather. Now, an ostrich feather represented the goddess Maat, or truth, right? And so you're weighing the human heart and its behavior alongside the Egyptian conception of truth. And if it turned out that the human heart was heavier than the feather, it was heavier than the truth, it weighed down the truth, then the heart itself would be consumed by one of the more vicious of the Egyptian goddesses, a goddess by the name of Ammit. And you see her there in the bottom picture. In the bottom picture on the left-hand side, you see the human heart, and you see that this heart is balanced out on the other side by the ostrich feather. There is Anubis doing the weighing, and that creature there on the left-hand side, it has the body of a hippo and a lion, and the head of a crocodile. This is the goddess Ammit. And if you were found to be morally wanting, in other words, if the heart was heavier than the feather, the heart was devoured by this creature. And it would lead to a restless afterworld existence, an existence where the body and the soul, the ka, the spirit, were completely separated. And so we can see here in ancient Egypt a fairly remarkable understanding of how to preserve bodies, of how to remove particularly the most perishable. When we get to the period of the great period of Western culture dissecting bodies, when we get to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it dawned on people quickly that the abdomen, the contents of the stomach, there was a lot of water, a lot of bacteria in the stomach cavity, the abdomen, and so those organs had to be removed quickest to stop the rest of the body from decomposing too rapidly. The Egyptians understood that. They took those body parts out. They got rid of the brain, which is also primarily water, and then they focused on the heart. And so we see here how the religious practice is what drove the medical knowledge, if we can call it that, the anatomical knowledge of the human body for the Greeks. And once again, it's aligned to immortality, that the spirit, the ka, and the body were going to have an arrangement where they could continue to coexist. So preserving those bodies became critically important. We know that in the Egyptian tombs, for instance, they didn't just deposit the sarcophagus that contained the mummy. They also brought all sorts of things like comforts, food, favorite furniture. They even would go so far as to kill and embalm the favorite pets, the cats, for instance, of the emperors that were most beloved to them, and they would accompany the body and the spirit of the kings, or even rich people, wealthy people. Ideally, we know about mummification of the rich, the wealthy, the pharaohs, because they had the money to be able to afford these kind of elaborate, expensive procedures. But ideally, the Egyptians would have liked to have embalmed everybody. If everybody had enough money to do that, they would all have been embalmed and mummified as a way of guaranteeing kind of eternal happy existence in the next world. So we move from the Egyptians, and we're talking about the great period of mummification from about 3,000, 3,500 maybe BC, down to about 500 BC, where these mummification practices were honed over a millennium. The priests / physicians, if you would call them that, who performed these operations on the body to prepare them for life in the afterworld. Not surprisingly, in Western culture, we move from the Egyptians then to the Greeks. And as we know, Greek philosophy, too, its origins were very religious. The Greeks quickly developed a scientific understanding of the world that did not contradict their religion, but allowed them to be more rational in their pursuit of material knowledge. The earliest known dissections taking place in the ancient Greek world stem from about 500 BC. And if we discount what the Egyptians were doing as not specifically dissective, what the Egyptians were doing were preparing bodies in the same way today when people die, embalmers, the people whose job it is to prepare the body for burial, will put some makeup on, they'll remove the perishable organs, they'll prepare a body for burial and religious services. If we discount that for a moment, by 500 BC, we knew that the Greeks, particularly Alcmaeon, was dissecting animals, not human beings. There was a prohibition. One of the things that we were dealing with here, with the spiritual nature of so much of early ancient cultures, from the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans, what we're dealing with here primarily are religious cultures who saw the body as, in many respects, sacred. If the body itself wasn't the temple of God, that concept hadn't quite evolved yet. Certainly, there were all sorts of spiritual, religious, and theological implications of taking bodies, dead bodies, and dissecting them, to do anything but respectfully, reverentially bury them, or in the case of the Romans, for instance, to burn them at times. To take bodies was to run the superstition risk that you would call down the wrath in the next world of the spirit that animated that body. So by not burying bodies quickly and praying over them and reverently performing our rites and our ablutions with them, if we don't do that, the fear was in the ancient world that there would be retribution on the part of the spirit whose body you had desecrated. To desecrate a corpse. Remember in our Greek mythology that bodies that were unburied couldn't cross over the river Styx into Hades. They couldn't go to the afterworld. Bodies that were drowned at sea, for instance, and didn't have a proper dirt burial. Those souls were condemned to wander almost ghost-like, a very unpleasant existence. Alcmaeon, however, in 500 BC, was actually, as far as we know, dissecting animals, and dissecting animals and paying attention to structure, form, and most importantly, utility. This is a remarkable thing, too. The earliest dissectors, and this is going to carry us all the way from Alcmaeon well into the Renaissance 2,000 years later. The earliest dissectors, like anatomists like Alcmaeon, they were primarily concerned with teleology. What was the purpose of what they saw in the body of the goat in this instance? They weren't terribly interested necessarily in assessing the structure or the makeup of the organs, or trying to figure out how they fit with other organs, what the relationships were. The primary enterprise of this kind of anatomy for Alcmaeon and the Greeks, it was utile. They were trying to figure out teleologically where the soul might have been. What was the animating principle behind all of this? So I want to make that really clear. The reason people began anatomizing first animals and then much later people, the reason we got involved with this is because in almost every single instance, we wanted to find out where the soul was. You think about the theological significance of that, right? The spirit, call it the ka, and the Greeks call it the soul for the Romans, the Greeks, Christian culture too. The idea that the soul was the immortal part of you that would outlive this body, that the body itself was a very finite, limited thing, very fragile, subject to decay immediately upon death. But it was the soul that would live forever, and it was the soul that gave the body its form. We'll see this in a moment with Aristotle. So when the soul left the body to pursue or to go or to be judged, to be assessed in some way and sent to its eternal reward or punishment, well, the body would fade to nothing. And so when people like Alcmaeon began dissecting animals, they were doing it for very, very different reasons than we would do it today, to find out how structure works, to find out how organs relate to processes in the body. That was a much lower concern for them. Interestingly, though, in contradiction to the Greeks, Alcmaeon was really the first person that we can historically record in Western culture who declared the brain the central organ of intelligence. He argued specifically that the brain controlled everything, whereas the Egyptians, all the way down through their history, thought the brain was... It's really kind of interesting. I mentioned how the Egyptians would sort of insert a hook into the skull to turn the brain into watery mush so it would then drain out. They thought the only purpose of the brain, the Egyptians, was to produce snot for your nose. That's what they thought it was. Here you have the Greeks, much more, but with more consistent methodological dissection of animals, and even vivisection, horrific as it is to contemplate today. We would not have modern medicine if at certain points in human history, live animals were cut open while they were still alive, to be able to witness how the body functioned and how it shut down in death, to be able to figure out in a living body, watching those processes shut down, what their animating purposes were. So even as unpalatable as it sometimes is for us to think about it, the dissection and the vivisection of living animals, it gave us a much more empirical and methodical basis. We're still a long way away from what you and I would call modern science. Nevertheless, even as early as 500 BC in Western culture with Alcmaeon and his school, you have the understanding that it is the brain. When you look at a human brain and how transient it is hugely, almost all water, a brain. It's not nearly as hardy or material as a liver or a heart, which is all muscle, for instance. And so the brain would evaporate pretty quickly, being water-based, which gives an explanation for why the Egyptians so misunderstood the role of the brain. But in his dissections of animals, Alcmaeon figured that out fairly quickly. Beyond Alcmaeon in 500 BC, we move to the next pioneering advancement in ancient anatomy, and that would be Hippocrates. Hippocrates is known as the greatest doctor of the ancient world, the greatest physician, and in reality, many people consider him the greatest doctor who ever lived, even though he lived a good 2,500 years ago, born about 460, died about 370 BC, so a near contemporary of Alcmaeon's. He was a physician primarily, Hippocrates. As a matter of fact, from Hippocrates, his great career, his writings, and the school that evolved who followed his teachings, we get the Hippocratic Oath. A much modified version modern doctors take, but the Hippocratic Oath that has been with us for thousands of years, the fundamental premise being that the first purpose of a doctor is to do no harm. Do no harm. The first thing you can do as a useful physician is not make a situation worse, not aggravate the wound, the disease, the condition. And so moving back to our image, Hippocrates, we know very little about the man, but we have a series of writings from him, including the very influential On the Wounds of the Head. And in this treatise of Hippocrates, discussing head wounds and how to treat them, we get a very relatively sophisticated discussion of the sutural patterns of the skull. So in order to deal with head wounds, obviously, this doctor had seen some pretty nasty ones where the scalp, the skin had been scraped away, and we don't know and we doubt that the ancient Greeks actually had access to human bodies. We know they didn't dissect human bodies, the ancient Greeks. We also know that they had almost no access to skeletons or human skulls. The idea that you would take the bones of people and hold on to them or try to put them together, which is called articulating them. When you take human bones and put them together to recreate a skeleton, that is called the process of articulating. It never dawned on them, given the religious significance of bodies, to take skeletons and to use them as these kind of teaching props, at least not as early as Hippocrates. So all the knowledge he had to come from observing actual bodies that had been wounded or recently killed. And in this case, On the Wounds of the Head, you get a really interesting discussion of the sutural patterns of the skull that suggests dissective knowledge, at least. And you also have, beyond his writings, the school of Hippocrates, which would go on for a couple of hundred years. So we have very little from the pen of Hippocrates, but what we have is a couple hundred years of treatises, many treatises written by various doctors down through the years in the wake of Hippocrates, who are part of what we now call the Hippocratic school. Hundreds of years worth of writings and traditions and medical knowledge passed down by writing, and much of it seems to suggest some increasing level of anatomical knowledge. For instance, the treatise from the Hippocratic school, known as On Fractures and Dislocations, has a really sophisticated discussion of an anatomical description of the shoulder joint that would require being able to see a functional shoulder joint. Again, we stress that from the time of the ancient Egyptians all the way down through the time of the Hippocratic school, there were no human bodies that were allowed to be dissected, and there was very little opportunity outside of dealing with live patients to begin to get a sense of what the body looked like on the inside. From the Hippocratic school, we move on to Aristotle, and this is absolutely, in many ways, the career of Aristotle is the defining moment for Western culture in terms of what would become science. Aristotle is our first biologist, and he primarily, if we had to label Aristotle as any one thing, first and foremost, we'd call him a philosopher. Right? Along with Plato, he and Plato represent the greatest philosophical period of human existence. The two of them together are as important as all the rest of the philosophical contributions put together in terms of how they put philosophy on its footing. And this really goes back to the point I was trying to make, too, that there was no science. You did not have empirical science as we understand it today available to people living this long ago. As scientific as we now recognize Aristotle was, in fact, much of the scientific method as we understand it today originates from his principles, his philosophy. In the ancient world, they referred to what we call as science. They refer to it as natural philosophy. Philosophy, right? The application of reason to subject matter. To take philosophy and apply it to the natural world, and that includes human bodies, that's natural philosophy. The second most important thing Aristotle was, besides being a philosopher, was a biologist. He is the world's first great biologist. But on top of that, he was our first really compelling anatomist. Again, dissected only animals. We have no evidence that he was allowed to or interested in dissecting human bodies, but he was a first-rate biologist. Many of the classifications in biology we now have today stem from Aristotle. He was the world's first methodical anatomist in this way. He was a comparative anatomist, really remarkable. He would dissect different species of animals and compare them and make notes, right? The first comparative anatomist. He was also our first embryologist, very interested in the generative development of creatures. So he has that famous experiment where he would take a hen's egg And every day he would hold that hen's egg up to the light so you could see through the shell, and he would draw pictures of the developing chick before he put it back to be incubated every day. And so he would have drawings that would demonstrate the evolution of the chick inside the egg. A first-grade embryologist as well. His books, and this is the thing that, again, I want to emphasize, that being a philosopher first, again, what is philosophy? It is taking the unique, distinctive property of human reason and applying it, right? The philosopher of God is called the theologian. He takes reason and applies it to contemplating things of God. The person who takes his reason, his philosophical reason, and applies it to morality is a moral philosopher or an ethicist. The person who takes his God-given reason and applies it to material reality, including human bodies, that's a natural philosopher. And so in his major works, the account of animals, the parts, you think about the anatomical nature of that, the account of animal life, the parts of animals. What are animals when you break them into the constituent parts? And the generation of animals. How do animals develop from the moment they are generated, to the way they develop until they're born and beyond that? And he, very interestingly, like the Egyptians and not like Alcmaeon, Aristotle made a big mistake in arguing that the heart was the primary organ of the body. He actually believed, too, as the Egyptians did, it was the first part that holding those chick eggs up, right? The first thing he could see move was that beating heart. So the heart appeared to be, to rational understanding, to the evidence of the senses. The heart seemed to be the first thing to live, and it seemed to be the last thing to stop living. When the heart stopped beating, they conceded that that's when death happened. And so for them, it made sense to put the heart at the center of everything. The thing that we move to the next slide, I think we want to remember about Aristotle, too, that philosophically, everything he was doing, his greatest work, arguably, is the De Anima. We have a slide for this with another great picture. Probably the most important work of Aristotle is his De Anima. It was a treatise of the soul, right? It was all about the soul. All of the dissecting, all of the anatomizing of animals that Aristotle did, he did for a very, very specific purpose. Aristotle dissected animals primarily because he wanted to find out where the soul was. It's kind of fanciful for us today. We know, even those of us who are a little queasy about medicine, who could never be doctors because the sight of blood makes us a little nervous, you still have a pretty good sense of what's located where. You know where your kidneys are, you know where your brain is, you know where your liver is, you know where your vital organs are, you have a good sense of where the heart is, you understand basically how the lungs work, how digestion works. We have such an understanding of this that we don't really have to feel the need to investigate it or to get too close to it. But imagine the ancients, somebody like Aristotle, whose primary purpose, as was the Greeks, right? As was the Greeks before him, and as were the Egyptians, the primary purpose of all of this tinkering with the insides of bodies was to determine knowledge about ultimately the soul, the eternal, the soul in the image of God, the soul that is that part of us that would be immortal, that part of us that doesn't die when the body dies. So in all of those philosophical treatises, the account of animals, the part of animals, parts of animals, Aristotle is pulling animals apart to try to make sense of the whole, right? What was it that gave life? What was it that preserved it? And it really is kind of a beautiful idea in Aristotle. If you look at the picture, that's from Raphael's school of Athens, the great Renaissance painter. And notice what he does. He pairs Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And there is Plato pointing straight up to the heavens. The Platonic philosophy argued that all that was true and real, all that was eternal, was heavenly. Everything on this earth was a weak carbon copy, a shadow of that ideal form, and the body more than anything else. So there's Plato, whose philosophical rationalism points north to the heavens, right? As a philosopher, Socrates and Plato, ultimately, they argued that the source of everything was the heavens. And there's Aristotle. Notice that his hand is middle of the road. Instead of pointing to the heavens, Aristotle seems to be palm out there, suggesting that there is truth about the eternal to be found in the material. Plato sought the truth of God beyond the limits of human mortality. Aristotle, on the other hand, and it makes sense that he would be, in many ways, our first great scientist, Aristotle here argues that you can study the things of this material world, those transient things that go away, especially bodies. You can study them very meticulously, dissect them, and learn many truths about the eternal. So what Aristotle was looking for in the de anima is the soul, right? And so he wanted to know what was the nature of the soul. Another beautiful idea of Aristotle's is, it really is a remarkably rational observation. Bodies look like bodies as long as they have souls. The minute the soul leaves the body, in other words, the minute the body dies, the body begins the process of turning into something else. 5 to 7 to 10 to 20 years after death, left to its own devices, the body doesn't look anything like it did when it was alive. Skin and flesh, muscle, all goes away. The skeleton is eventually revealed, and after a certain period of time, the skeleton itself returns to the dust out of which it was formed. So as long as the soul is in the body, Aristotle recognized, what we call the soul was in the body, the soul provided form. The universe is made up of all these random atoms. The universe is made up of material. And until you take material and you form it, it's just random chaos, right? And so Aristotle argued that what made a living creature was whatever it was that was the soul in it. And he argued there are 3 types of souls. A soul for animals, a soul for plants, plants, animals, and people. He makes the argument here that there was a vegetative or a nutritive soul. That was the soul that you found exclusively in plants. That was the soul, the thing within them that allowed them to grow, that allowed them to nourish themselves, and that allowed them to reproduce themselves. We call it a vegetative soul because vegetable matter it applies to, or we call it nutritive, able to nutriate yourself, to feed and grow and reproduce based on what you take in. All plants had vegetative souls, but none of the other souls. Animals had vegetative souls. They were able to eat, to grow, to reproduce. And by the way, eating, growing, and reproducing, those are all non-intellectual functions. Plants that have no intellect have no brain. They grow, they nutrify, they reproduce. Animals could do those things, right? When animals ate food, they didn't have to think about or will that food to become energy. It just happened within them. And so animals have the vegetative soul, but they also have the sensate soul, the animal or the sensate soul. And beyond growth, nutrition, and reproduction, the animal soul also allowed living animals to locomote themselves, to move, right? Plants are bound to where they are. Animals with this higher level soul, they can move, they can carry themselves places, and more importantly, they have the power to perceive. They have the power to sense, right? They can hear, they can smell, they can sense. Human beings, the apex of the created world, the top of the system, they had the vegetative soul. They could grow, nutrify themselves, and reproduce. They had animal souls. They could move and perceive. But unlike any other creature in God's world, they had the power of intellect, right? They could reason. It's the highest order thing in the universe. It was that power of intellect that caused human beings like Aristotle to turn his attention not necessarily to God and theology, but to looking for God remember that flat palm, right? Looking for God in this material realm. And what better place? The ancient Greeks believed categorically that the human being was the microcosm, that whatever was in the universe proper could be found in man. That when the gods made men, they made men with everything in the universe compacted in them, right? So what you could see by studying nature writ large, all stars, lakes, rivers, trees, mountains, right? All of that is, to some degree, inside the human body. You've got all sorts of watery in the body. You've got all sorts of rocky solid skeletons. You have all the things inside the microcosm that you have in the macrocosm. So we have 2 kinds of scientists, right? In some ways, Aristotle was both. He studied nature. He studied the world around him. He tried to make sense of all of biology. Having done that, he also recognized that what better way to study the universe, the whole cosmos, than to study, if not man, which was religiously prohibited, then certainly you could study other living animals to begin to get a sense of how this goes. And that gives rise to this three-pronged conception of the soul. And so I love that argument, that you have form and it's also, by the way, very much an argument in the book of Genesis, isn't it? God says that in the beginning, you had chaos, you had the void, right? You had matter, stuff. For the Hebrews, that was perceived as water, right? You have this watery chaos before God steps into that chaos. His spirit, we're told in Genesis, the spirit of the Lord broods over the water. And what does he do? He takes formlessness and gives it shape, right? Out of that vast watery chaos of elements, he begins to put things together. He separates the light. He separates the land from the other masses. He creates the land from the waters and separates them, light and dark. And out of the land, he then takes more of that formless dirt and molds it into the shape of a man and then breathes into the mouth of Adam. He breathes soul. Soul is form, and form and matter, right? That's what a human body is. Random form made human by the imposition of an eternal soul. A soul, the Christian God tells us, very much like in the image of the God who made him. And so you got from Aristotle this beautiful elaboration of these principles. Also quite interesting is that Aristotle and the Christian scriptures agree on this idea too, that the microcosmic, macrocosmic, right? The Judeo-Christian culture would evolve in the same way. This man created in the image of God, that by studying the inside of the human body, you would first and foremost cut bodies open eventually to find out the fingerprint of God. Less important was man, and less important was this organ or that bone or this muscle. More important was, now that the organism is open, do we see God's handiwork? Do we see God's fingerprint anywhere on the inside of the body? It's really a remarkable thing. Moving on from Aristotle, and again, I cannot overestimate, even though he was wrong about many, many things. We now know that his anatomy, his dissections his assumptions in his dissections were wrong. Makes sense. He wasn't dissecting human bodies to begin with, right? So he's basing everything on the dissection of lower, oftentimes much lower species. And so we come now from Aristotle, who died in the 4th century BC, down to the time of Herophilus and Erasistratus. Two names you probably haven't heard, two of the most important names in the history of dissection. They lived in Ptolemaic Egypt, Alexandria, after the death of Alexander the Great in the early 4th century, 323 BC, let's say. Thereabouts, Alexander died. And when Alexander died, and as a young man, Alexander died, and left his empire broken. And so what happened? Different generals and follower-ons of Alexander, the generals, they took different parts of the empire. To Egypt fell the Ptolemies. And in Ptolemaic Egypt, in Alexandria, a museum means something different for us. A museum is a place where we store artifacts today, or art. A museum for them, for the ancients, was the house of the muses. It was not a place where you stored dead things. It was a place where all the arts and sciences were pursued. Alexandria, Egypt, from about 320 BC to about 200 BC, the time of the Ptolemies, became a remarkable center of scholarship. One of the most progressive, had one of the best libraries anywhere in the ancient world. It became a remarkable attraction for people who wanted to conduct what we would call scientific research. These two men, Herophilus and Erasistratus. Herophilus, born about 335 BC, died about 280. He is called the founder of modern anatomy because for the very first time consistently in Western culture, we now have somebody under the relatively tolerant views of the Ptolemaic leaders who is allowed to dissect human cadavers. So that much of what Herophilus did and wrote, we don't have much of what he wrote. One of the reasons why you don't know him is because we have almost nothing in his name. We know of Herophilus because of what later ancient physicians say about him, but we don't have his own writings. But we do know that what he discovered and what he looked for in the human body, it was based on the actual dissection of corpses, human corpses, over the first time, and only for a very little time. From about 300 BC to about 200 BC, did you have actual rigorous and prolonged dissection of cadavers. In the ancient Ptolemaic world, we have writings that stipulate that the corpses, the bodies that Herophilus and Erasistratus were able to work on, were in almost every case the body of felons, criminals, who would be executed. Kind of makes sense. All right? Those moral and religious and superstitious concerns about bodies that plagued pagan minds, they didn't go away. just because Herophilus and Aristotle were working on a whole nother level intellectually in terms of approaching science, the science of dissecting human bodies, nevertheless, that prohibition and the superstition endured. So the only bodies that were available to these two great researchers were the bodies of criminals who had been executed for felonies. Those bodies were turned over to the anatomist as a kind of extra punishment beyond the grave, which palliated a little bit in the minds of the average citizen the transgressive nature of what was happening. Herophilus was really remarkable. He, once and for all, ended the debate. He demonstrated the primacy of the brain. We're talking, again, 275 BC. He distinguished the motor nerves from the sensory nervous system, the motor and sensory nerve reflexes. He distinguished between the cerebellum and the cerebrum in the brain. He first traced the optic nerve from the eyes back to the brain, and a whole host of other things. Really remarkable when you think about the fact that they didn't have microscopes. They did not have what you and I would consider to be the right kinds of tools. They didn't have the delicate scalpels. They didn't have the kind of meticulous forceps, the things that modern doctors can use to open and to spread and to look into human bodies without necessarily pulling things apart in a rough way. Also keep in mind that in the ancient world, they conducted their anatomical research all without refrigeration, which means the smell, the danger of decomposition, the possibility that disease. They didn't have rubber gloves. So bodies that were diseased, opening bodies that were otherwise sick, and then putting your bare hands into them. They didn't quite recognize it, but the possibility, the danger of mortality of picking up something. They had to be very brief and quick. They had to dissect rapidly. They had to do it. They tried to do it usually in the wintertime when it was a little cooler. And they had to dispose of those parts of the body that were most corruptible. Just like we saw 2,000 years earlier, the Greeks removing the intestines and the organs of the abdomen, which were watery and contained a lot of bacteria, removing those quickly to be able to get at skeleton and muscle and bone, sinew, things that last longer. So Erasistratus was not quite the dissector that Herophilus was, but he is considered the founder of modern physiology. Much of the research that Erasistratus did was not on dissection and biology, although he dissected. It was on the physical processes of the body. So he tells us much about the physiological operating of the living body, and he based that on his observations of dead bodies. One of the most remarkable aspects of this, by the way, is that much later, by the time you get to the early Christian world, 100, 200 AD, about 500 years after these two men were working, Christian writers, particularly Tertullian, suggested, by reading their accounts of the ancients, suggested for the first time that these two men, Erasistratus and Herophilus, that they were guilty of vivisection. Later Christian writers argued that these two Greek researchers actually took living human beings, tied them down, and opened them up, and to study the interior workings of the human body before inevitably that body would die for having been opened that way. There's no evidence from the time of Herophilus and Erasistratus that it happened, but these rumors, this innuendo, we do know, by the way, that many ancient doctors in their writings suggested it would be far better to understand human bodies if we could do what we do with animal bodies, if we could take human bodies and open them while the bodies were still alive. As we do with animals, we'll have a much better sense of things. This is the Roman physician Galen, Claudius Galen. He's actually a Greek who was living in the Roman Empire, and he was actually the private physician to a number of emperors. You may have watched the movie Gladiator, for instance, and you may remember the wicked emperor Commodus from that movie. Galen was his personal physician. We believe that, we're not exactly quite sure of the dates. We believe that Galen was born about 129 AD, died about 199 AD, anywhere. I've seen dates anywhere from 110, 115, all the way to 200, 205, somewhere in that vicinity. The Greek physician living in Rome, Galen of Pergamon. He dissected almost exclusively Barbary apes. Interesting. Whereas other physicians dissected pigs, the two animals that came closest to replicating human structure, pigs and apes. The skin of pigs, we know, is very, very much similar to human skin. The musculature of the apes is much more, and the skeletal nature of the apes, much more closely related to what you see in human beings than lesser species like dogs, for instance, who sometimes fell victim to this as well. And so he dissected almost primarily pigs, but primarily Barbary apes. And so what's really interesting about Galen after all these years is when you study his treatises on the muscles and the bones, for instance, are actually pretty good. They hold up reasonably well after 2,000 years. Because again, there's a similarity in myology, muscular structure, and skeletal structure to what you see in modern human beings. Much different when he's talking about, of course, the interior functioning of the organs and the things like that. Very different. So Galen, put it this way, most of what we know about Herophilus, and almost all of what we know about Herophilus and Erasistratus comes not from them, none of their writings survive, but it comes from the writing of Galen. He was a copious dissector. He dissected all the time higher animal species like monkeys. And so he was a lifelong dissector, part of his professional career. He also gives us all of this information on previous doctors and the medical tradition going all the way back to Hippocrates. Many documents, many ideas, many treatises he speaks about we have no recollection of because they've been lost. So much of what we know about ancient medicine we know by Galen, oftentimes arguing. He didn't like the doctors who came before him. He thought his methodology was far superior to what others, including Aristotle, were doing. And so you'll find in the writings of Galen an antithetical, if not hostile engagement, but an engagement with the whole of the tradition going all the way back to Alcmaeon and beyond. And so the kinds of dissections, the kind of researches that Galen were doing were cutting edge at the day. He dissected more and more frequently than just about anybody else in the ancient world. And we also know this, that we know for a fact he didn't dissect human bodies. We know for a fact Romans were much less accommodating to the idea of taking corpses and cutting them to pieces than even the Greeks were. The Romans were much more superstitious and nervous spiritually about it, and so they had much greater restrictions than even the Greeks did. Now, we had seen that except for one window of about 100 years, the Greeks didn't do it either, but you did have that one little relatively forward-looking 100-year period in Alexandria where people like Herophilus and Erasistratus were able to dissect corpses. Some later people even charged vivisect human bodies. But Galen never did. Galen is very direct. There were only 2 occasions on which he ever saw a human skeleton complete. One was when somebody drowned in the river, a fast-running river, and the body was allowed to sit before it was found, and enough water had washed over it that the flesh had been washed away, and all that remained was the skeleton. He was able to study that. The other thing that's really interesting about Galen is besides being the physician to the emperors, the man trying to keep the emperor alive, he was also the physician to the gladiators in Rome. So he would be a present at the gladiatorial games, and you get the impression that this was something he wanted to do, right? He wanted to be a gladiator doctor, not because he was the emperor's physician. He wanted to be a gladiatorial doctor because he wanted to be able to study the wounds, the kind of vicious slashing, the kind of sword and dagger wounds, the kind of trident wounds that you see, ripping flesh away, exposing bone, allowed him, while he was trying to help these injured warriors, to actually study the interior of the body. Moving to the next slide here, in the next picture, there's an actual picture, an artist rendering of Galen studying a gladiatorial wound. We don't quite know. You could just sort of see. Was he more interested in actually trying to keep the gladiator alive, or was he more interested in getting a look at this wound or that part of the body that had been exposed? He was the physician of the gladiators, and like Aristotle, Galen was interested in anatomy first and foremost for teleology. The teleology of a thing is its final purpose. So when Galen studied the human body in theory and the animal bodies on his dissection table, he was looking first and foremost for what was the ultimate purpose of this bone or of that organ or of the body before him on the table. And so it gave rise to this ridiculous position that ancient doctors were studying dead things, dissecting bodies, primarily because they wanted to look at utility and function. How do you understand the purpose of something if you don't know the structures that put it together? So even when you got to the point in time when Galen was dissecting, and Galen, as we're going to see in lecture number 2, for 1,500 years, doctors would stop looking at human bodies and read his books. That's what's coming for 1,500 years. Because Galen was so influential, so powerful, and so comprehensive in the kind of research he conducted, for almost 1,500 years in the Western world, bodies would cease to be dissected, and the books of Galen would be read in their place. We'll see what trouble that causes in our second lecture.